Good afternoon. I'm Brian Yablonsky, and I'm honored to be up here today to introduce our keynote speaker. But first, before I got to that, I wanted to, where is our good friend Joel Klein? Is he in the audience? There's Joel, right there. So there were some of us who were at the National Archives last night, and the archives, very interesting place, as the governor talked about today. You know, the past is prologue, really interesting. The Declaration, inspiring. The Bill of Rights, amazing. But the most fascinating thing that I saw and heard last night at the National Archives was Governor Bush calling Joel Klein his brother from another mother. And you know, Joel, this is hard to picture. But I'm actually here to tell you that the first and original brother from another mother to Governor Bush is not Joel Klein, but former President William Jefferson Clinton. And that is according to the highest authority in the land, Barbara Bush. So it is only fitting that we have with us today one of President Clinton's most trusted and senior advisors, former White House Chief of Staff John Podesta. John is a familiar face in Washington. In addition to serving 3 years as the President's Chief of Staff, he's been a counselor to Democratic leader Tom Daschle. He was chief counsel to numerous Senate committees, and he was the co-chairman of President Obama's transition team in charge of the cabinet secretary appointments. So we could probably thank John for Arne Duncan as secretary. Today, John is founder, chair, and counselor of the Center for American Progress, an institute advocating progressive policy. And this is really, it's an example, as Governor Bush was saying this morning, about where the center left and the center right can come together and might meet. The Center for American Progress under John Podesta has advocated for, in the education arena, higher and more challenging standards, meaningful teacher and principal evaluation systems, teacher pay for performance, and meaningful testing. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Podesta.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Brian. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Governor Bush, and to the Foundation for Excellence in Education for inviting me to be here today. It will probably come as no shock to anyone in the room that the governor and I don't agree on everything, notwithstanding his relationship to my ex-boss. But one thing I think we both agree on is the importance of having strong voices in both parties, championing the cause of education as a critical element of our nation's agenda, and building a strong coalition in the center to demand reform of our public education system, a system that, quite frankly, is still not working for too many of our students. Governor, I really admire that, building on your success as governor, you've invested so much time in keeping the nation's attention focused on the need for education reform through this foundation. This summit, your passion this morning, that amazing speech that you gave this morning, are a testament to that. And I applaud you and view you as a partner in these many activities. It's also, I think, it's a pleasure for me to be here with so many reform leaders and so many friends. Joel and I actually had the chance to work together in the White House before he became famous, to talk to you about education reform and the issues that brought you here today. There's certainly a lot to talk about. I've been asked to actually put on my political analyst hat and reflect on how our most recent election will affect the prospects for education reform. At the presidential level, the only issue that got much airtime really was the cost of college. And I found that kind of shocking that there was virtually no debate on how our early childhood and K through 12 systems actually prepare young people to be ready for college or for a meaningful career. Maybe that's not so much of a surprise in that politics is a kind of combat sport. It's about conflict, and perhaps both Governor Romney and President Obama agreed on more than they disagreed in the education reform area. Governor recognized the work of Arne Duncan. it's hard to take credit when the president picks his local school superintendent and brings him back to Washington for that, notwithstanding the fact that I grew up in Chicago. I think the president deserves credit for that one. But it wasn't a point of contention in the presidential race, and with the exception of a kind of a throwaway question that Jim Lehrer gave the two candidates at the end of the presidential debate, which I would note about half of the answer on both sides ended up being about green jobs and the Solyndra loan. There was very little mention in the presidential race, and I really think that's unfortunate for our country, and I want to come back to how we change that dynamic a little bit. However, there was a lot happening in state and local races, and I think that does give us a snapshot of where voters stand on many of the issues being discussed at this conference. To me, there are a few takeaways that education reformers should consider as we try to move forward on the ambitious agenda the governor laid out this morning. Let's start with substance. We have to remember that this is about putting kids first. The politics are important, but we often lose sight of what the politics are for. We have a national economic need, and we have a moral obligation to ensure our students have equal opportunity and achieve the outcomes they need to succeed. I know we say that a lot, but we can't forget to return to this foundational principle to check what we are doing against the ultimate goal of creating a student-centered education system. So what does that require? In my view, it requires an accountability system that ensures students achieve at the highest levels and that action occurs when those levels aren't reached. It requires a teacher and principal workforce who are rigorously trained, highly skilled, and comprehensively evaluated and supported to improve. It requires a funding system that's fair and equitable, not the one we have today, where kids who need the most help get the least. It requires extended learning time and greater learning opportunities so that students who are behind catch up to their peers, and so that all students get a well-rounded education that prepares them for this century, not the last one. Certainly, it requires the entire system that supports innovation, embrace of technology, and reform rather than hindering them. And in my view, it still requires a strong federal role in achieving those goals. The recent elections tell us a fair amount, I think, about what it will take to put in place that kind of system and these kinds of changes. To me, the bottom line of these elections, this past election that we just witnessed, is that reform is not a foregone conclusion, at least not in the way that many of us maybe have just assumed just a few years ago. When Tony Bennett, a reform-minded Republican chief state school officer, loses in a Republican-leaning state, that tells me reform is not yet on solid ground, and that the far edges of the left and the right can beat back reforms even when they don't talk to each other at all. You could chalk the Bennett race up to one election, but when combined with overturning of reform laws in Republican-friendly states like Idaho and South Dakota, it's easy to come to the conclusion that unions won and reformers lost, even in conservative union-skeptic states. Of course, there are counterexamples, like the ballot initiative approval of charters in Washington, but there is clearly bipartisan work for us in this room to do from the center to advance the reform agenda. And as the lines blur between reformers and non-reformers, the movement has to invest in collaboration and in organizing in order to build a broader coalition to sustain the reforms that we all believe in. So let me make an observation that's probably controversial in this room. I think the complete division between unions and reform is not helpful. We have to let that go if we're going to move forward. Just a few weeks ago, Governor Chris Christie and Randy Weingarten appeared on Morning Joe to talk about the new teacher contract in Newark. If Christie wasn't in enough trouble for embracing President Obama, being nice to Randy Weingarten on Morning Joe will certainly get tempers to flare. And I know I talked to Chris Surf, I know there's a big backstory here, but the truth is the Newark contract is a pretty good contract. I'd say a very good contract from an accountability perspective. They said over and over, Christie and Weingarten, how the election told them that voters don't care so much about the labels as they do about solving problems. And when all parties lay down their swords and take up collaboration, a lot can get done. I would argue that while there are clearly still strong rejectionist voices in unions, national union leadership has come a fair distance in recognizing that teacher effectiveness matters and that evaluation systems need to include student outcomes. The sheer reality of demographics within unions is changing too, and we should keep that in mind. It will be a strong force, I think, for reforming the status quo. The majority of teachers have less than 10 years of experience. And younger teachers, I think, know what counts. They're more reform-minded. A number of teacher voice chapters have been organized, and they tend to support a lot of the reforms that I think most of the people in this room think are necessary. Remember, members of these groups are most likely union members as well. The dynamics are changing, and reformers can and should make common cause where we can with progressive teachers and union leadership willing to put kids first. Voters and the public listen to their teachers. Look at the Chicago teacher strike, where parents and the public were on the side of the union for most of the strike. In my view, if you go to war on your workforce, sooner or later you're likely to lose. So the question, I think, for reformers is how do you keep the pressure on unions to change? How do you keep the pressure on to put kids first without demonizing teachers in the process? Reformers will also have to learn that you can't steamroll reforms without doing the hard work of convincing the public that you're right. Reformers with good justification believe they're working particularly on behalf of poor communities. But I think, quite frankly, they're not doing a good enough job of reflecting and building support among those very communities. I'm a resident of the last colony. I supported the ambitious education reforms in D.C. pushed by Mayor Fenty and Chancellor Rhee, but they lacked the community support that was necessary, and that got us Mayor Gray. I think a key takeaway from these elections is to stop just focusing only on your enemy and start shoring up allies, especially parents and teachers. The governor mentioned this morning, but the movement towards parent empowerment and organizations like Parent Revolution, I think, are good first steps of building that coalition that can go out into the neighborhoods and really begin to build the building blocks of sustaining the reform that's so necessary. That leads me to a second but related point. I believe a key lesson learned is the importance of political muscle, not just policy muscle. Reformers have been rightly focused on getting their policies and practices right, especially with implementing the big reforms like Common Core, teacher and principal evaluation systems, and increased school choice. Governor, you and I probably disagree here on choice. I think vouchers are something of an unneeded distraction. We should concentrate on public school choice. But regardless of the work is steep to get all that done. And I think, you've been a champion of charter schools in Florida and across the country. We have a lot of work to do, but you can't just play the inside game without an outside game. This election taught us that passing a reform-minded law doesn't mean voters will support it in a year or two after its implementation. You've got to build a movement and an organization to support those efforts. My third point is that we have to ensure that education reform doesn't fall victim to the partisanship that has so overtaken and plagued our national politics. We've known for a while that education reform does not break easily along party lines. Where there was a President George H.W. Bush, there was a Governor Bill Clinton. Where there was a President George W. Bush, there was a Ted Kennedy. Where there is Jeb Bush, there's also a Dan Malloy who passed major legislation earlier this year in Connecticut. Where there's a John King, there's also a Kevin Huffman. Now the lines are blurring even more. I think Kevin is a Democrat working for a Republican governor. This is even truer in the electorate. You saw Washington State, which I mentioned, Georgia, approved charter schools for the first time. The voters in Indiana ousted Tony Bennett. Voters in Indianapolis approved reform-minded candidates for school board who were supported by Democrats for education reform. I know Indianapolis is not synonymous with Indiana. I did grow up in Chicago. I'm familiar with the state. But it strikes me as a complication in the traditional coalition. Maybe it's urban versus suburban, but I think it might also have to do with organization and the fact that the public may support part of the reform agenda while not other parts, some candidates but not others. So reformers have to get down deep at the ground level and fight the local battle and create broad, center-based coalitions to win these fights. Fourth, my last point is that implementation is key. We've got to get these big reforms right if the public is to accept future reforms. The Common Core standards are a massive shift in terms of content and teaching strategies. Let's focus some energy on making sure teachers have the support they need to succeed, or else the Common Core, I believe, will blow up. The same is true for the new assessment systems and teacher and principal evaluation systems. Doing those well will require patience and investment of time and resources. Those two things are sometimes in short supply among reformers who are hungry for a quick win or visible results. If we can look up in 2 or 3 years and see positive, sustained reforms across several states, I think we'll have earned some much-needed political capital. Writing legislation is always easy. You know, I started and ran a think tank. Writing legislation is easier than carrying it out. Don't let up halfway through the race. Implementation is everything. Lastly, I don't think that the elections will change the federal agenda all that much, though I do think a strong federal role, as I said, is needed to support reform. You're going to hear from Arne Duncan tomorrow. Maybe he'll disagree with that. But in my view, the Obama administration has made its key priorities clear. The Republicans are pretty much in the same place, though contemplating, I suppose, if their anti-federal wing of the party is moved too extreme. We'll see if the administration proposes new reforms, but I would look for a shift to implementation, as I mentioned, and oversight of things like Race to the Top, the waivers that the department's granted. I understand the department is looking to release new rules on teacher preparation accountability. I think a much-needed effort there. Regardless of what those rules are, though, it seems to me this area is ripe for cooperation between the center-right and the center-left. I also know that Secretary Duncan has said a few times he wishes he had done more on early childhood education. I'm not sure if they're going to propose a new initiative. I certainly hope so, but I think it's a ripe area for investment and reform. Now, if my points are right, the blurring lines, the need for solid organizing and implementation, the need for a centrist coalition that embraces teachers and parents, that means fighting on two fronts: achieving policy wins and building the infrastructure to support them. And while recognizing new issues will emerge that probably few of us can imagine, we have to do both those things. Get the policy right, but build the organizational muscle to get that policy first implemented and then sustained over the long term. The ground is shifting, so the key will be to stay true to the principles that animate this movement, an unwavering commitment to improving student outcomes, particularly for disadvantaged students, no matter what challenges present themselves. That is what animates our work at CAP. I know it's what animates Governor Bush and the foundation. I know it's what animates all the people in this room. I thank you for your time, for your dedication, for your attention. The governor charged all of us this morning with sticking to the task. And this is a long-term struggle. And I just echo his words that we have to stay in the fight. We're going to have some wins, we're going to have some losses, but we have to keep at it because our kids are dependent on it. So thank you for inviting me to be here today with you, Governor. Where do you want?
Wherever you like.
All right. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Chucker Penn with the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. I don't think I have to introduce you to Governor Jeb Bush. Thank you very much, John Podesta. This is the second major speech of the day that I found myself in nearly total agreement with. Thank you both. According to the script for this session, we have roughly 9 minutes to dispatch all remaining issues pertaining to bipartisanship in education reform. And so let's start right quick by asking Jeb whether he agrees with John.
Other than that private voucher shot across the bow, yeah. I think we need systemic change, and any tool that we have at our disposal to move to a child-centered system ought to be used. I'm probably most excited about things. We fight past battles a lot, and if you look over the horizon, it's inevitable that our schools are going to change. Technology is going to change it, whether we have closed monopolistic systems or open, transparent systems. And I think we should accelerate that as fast as possible to move to a child-centered system. And frankly, there may be less political fights there, which is what John's main point that I think is really important, is that we need to build political coalitions to support reform in all of its varying forms. And we should be open to the idea of people of diverse backgrounds, diverse ideologies, joining forces. And I'm most encouraged that in education, at least, the potential of this is really in front of us. We can do this. Whereas in other parts of policy world, particularly here in our nation's capital, I'm not as optimistic.
Isn't this coalition building a 50-year project? Is this coalition building going to be done in time to benefit the next couple of generations of actual kids? It's easy to get sort of center-right, center-left policy convergence, but then we go back to the real world of state capitals where people are at each other's throat. And as you just said, journey up to Capitol Hill, which has been gridlocked over education along with many other things for quite a while now.
Well, you know, I started by saying that the student-centered approach is, I think, what can build that coalition. That's, I think, where Republicans and Democrats can come together. And I think if you look back at the work that Congressman Miller, Senator Kennedy did with President Bush, if you look at the work that you were able to accomplish working with a bipartisan coalition in your state, Governor, it's because people focused on student outcomes, and particularly for the most disadvantaged. That's, I think, what can draw people together. And if we keep that front and center, then I think we can get past what, as I said, is a poisonous atmosphere here. I think we've seen that with leadership in Washington. I think it's a little bit in shorter supply these days, particularly on Capitol Hill. But it's why it's so important for those of us who believe in this cause to be up there and working to support those people who will stick their necks out and try to reach across the aisle and find common ground.
Can I use an example of how it can be done? I mean, we do have a political challenge that in most states, reform is driven by conservative Republicans, not all states. And the constituencies that typically benefit the most are not necessarily the Republican constituencies. And on the left, you have constituencies of adults that are resistant. So you have a kind of a strange, normally, you know, good politics yields, or good policy yields good politics, and it kind of helps sustain this. So the work that is requires a coalition, you can't do this unilaterally over the long haul. But in Florida, we have a corporate tax scholarship program that's the largest in the country now, and it has incredible popular support. There are 50,000 kids that go to private schools it's needs-based, and every year there's a rally in Tallahassee. The largest civil rights rally, in essence, in Tallahassee is a rally to protect and support the corporate tax scholarship program. And they go, moms and dads, kids, 90% are kids at the poverty level or near it or below it. 90% are Latino and African American kids. They come and their teachers are there, they're wearing their uniforms, they're there to lobby the members of the legislature. And in Florida, there is a majority of the African American Democratic legislators support the corporate tax scholarship program because they know that there is political support back home in their districts. People don't want to lose what they have. They like the choice of being able to send their kids to this option. And it's the success of the program is what protects it. And there's a coalition of popular support now amongst Democrats and Republicans for this. That's what we need to try to do. And Florida's not the only model where this happens. In policy world, many states are now doing this. The reading program in Colorado was a A good example, John, of what you described. And there are other examples like that. Depending on the conditions of the states, you have to deal with the other side, and you should, in order to sustain the success of the programs.
The original enactment, however, I'll bet was not bipartisan, was it?
It was a little different. At the beginning there was no kumbaya moments. No, that's true. It was, in fact, I'd say, I can't remember if any Democrats supported it to begin with, but now, as I said, over time, you have a significant support that is sustained through political elections every election cycle, and it's and the success of the program ultimately. Good policy does create the climate for popular support. I mean, if the thing fails, then clearly you've got to go to another alternative, right?
You both talked about parental empowerment, and you just gave one example that certainly incorporates parental empowerment. And yet it struck me for many years that parents, though the largest constituency in American education, are the least organized and the least represented, except by those whom they send to the legislature. How else can a parent-centric education reform force emerge? What's the formula for this? How's this going to happen? Either of you, both of you.
Well, I think you see experimentation going on in the states at a policy level through these triggers that give support for parents to intervene in the running of their schools, but also at the organizational level. And the governor mentioned one effort, but I think there are others to try to get ultimately. Though I think education has to rise on the political agenda to get parents motivated to think they can effectuate change, and so that goes to I guess a job for all of us, and one that the governor's particularly doing a good job with, which is to force this up on the nation's agenda. Then I think parents can find a way to organize to demand better results. They, of course, need transparency. They need information. They need to be able to know what's really going on in their schools. I think those kinds of inputs we're pretty well aware of, but it's going to take investment, I think, in creating foundational organization, and that won't happen unless people think this is a high-stakes proposition for the country.
One of the things that is going to be very valuable is this research being done, taking the OECD PISA test and bringing it down, not just at a national level, but bringing it down to the high school level, literally, so that if you're in suburban DC, you think, oh my gosh, our schools are so good. This is a problem of the urban core. As a mom or a dad, you don't worry about it as much because you think your schools are okay. Well, when you compare fancy pants high schools, no disrespect to beautiful suburban Washington, D.C., the financial capital and real estate capital of the United States now, no unemployment, high income, everything is great. If you compare those students and those schools to comparable schools in Stockholm or Helsinki or Paris or Korea, and you start pointing out that no, we're not as good, it will create a sense of maybe shaking the complacency, which I think is the first step. There is a complacency here that people of opinion leaders and people that have more disproportionate influence don't view their own kids' plight as bad at all. And we need to create some awareness, I think, as John said, through information, that this is a serious challenge for our country, and it's, sadly, it's changing who we are as a nation, and we're losing our competitive edge because of it as well.
Oh, and this building level PISA, that's a project underway, a really good one, and then also the Common Core assessments that will bring it right down to the kid level, how your child is doing in relation to these rigorous and we hope world-class standards, will certainly give people information. At the same time, however, if you've got a smug suburban constituency, and the teachers in those schools are also grumping that the politicians and the policymakers are making their life harder, threatening their jobs, giving them too much to do, narrowing the curriculum.
Teaching to the test.
So if you've got a sort of complacent constituency and grumpy teachers, how does the reformer prevail?
Well, I think we've got a new, I mentioned this in my prepared remarks. I think we have to look at this new cohort of teachers particularly, these people coming into the profession, and not kind of lump them in and dismiss them as having rejected reform. I think we have got to find
a chance at least.
I think more than give them a chance, I think we have to support their own voices and organization at that level to find a way to become a powerful force, both within their districts, but also within their unions to demand. Look, they don't want the same sort of complacency that you're describing, Checker. They want to be able to perform, to deal for their kids, to have an exciting classroom, to take advantage of the technological innovation. And we need to find ways, I think, to push policies that promote innovation and promote giving sort of some more voice and more authority to people at the ground level.
Let me just push this to one more aspect of adult interests prevailing. In Ohio, at least, where we spend a lot of time working at the Fordham Institute, it's not just teacher unions that try to sustain the status quo. It's things like school boards and superintendents and even charter operators who have now gotten entrenched with their mediocre charter schools in a lot of places and don't want to change. Adult interests are all over the place. They're not just teachers.
Absolutely, which I think is a good political point that in the political realm, some of us probably fall prey to view this, as John said in his remarks, there's got to be a way to bring everybody into, at least to give people a chance to embrace these reforms, and we'd be surprised maybe that the support might be bigger and broader. And the people who should be supportive may not be as much because there's an entrenched economic interest. I think it's a great point. And it's something that my thinking on this has evolved a bit, just because I sense that once you get into, you get to use an old Texas expression, once you get your snout closer to the high-grade slop in the front of the trough, the passion for reform begins to subside, and we should be vigilant across the board on this. And one of the things I think it's also important is when you pass provocative law change, and many states are looking, for example, on teacher assessment and teacher performance. There's a lot of places now are changing the law to deal with this. There has to be faithful, thoughtful execution of those laws and put it into reality so that people who are legitimately fearful of the potential downside of these things and the fear of change, those fears subside and you can turn someone from an opponent to either neutral or being a supporter. And the execution, I saw Kevin Huffman give a presentation at another conference where he talked about the excruciating efforts in Tennessee to get the teacher effectiveness bill implemented right, where thousands and thousands of hours of listening to teachers to get buy-in. And it was a wake-up call for me. I'm no longer in a position where I can call someone up and say, do this, but to not do that, you end up creating opposition instead of having support. To faithfully execute on these bigger, complex things is really critically important.
So I want to ask about hardball politics, things like campaign contributions and doorbell ringing and phone banks and things like that. More and more this last go-round, we heard about reform money going into people's campaigns, school board campaigns, state legislature campaigns. We heard about defer money. We read about Bloomberg money, et cetera, et cetera. Do we need to encourage this? Do we need more of this? Do we need the reformers to dig deeper into their non-tax exempt pockets and contribute more to people's political campaigns?
Yes.
Total bipartisan agreement.
So dig deeper out there.
And be effective. Be effective on the messaging. There's some lessons learned as was described, and we should learn them. It's political communications is evolving, and how you communicate, the means by which you do it, and what you say and who you say it to, all that stuff is changing pretty dramatically in American political life. And so learn from the lessons of each election cycle to get better at it.
So whose job is it to recruit the candidates who want to do education reform at the local level or the state level? Do we just wait for them to pop up, or do education reformers have to go and talk them into running?
Well, you know, that's a question I haven't given a lot of thought to, but I think that the question sort of implies the answer, which is that I think the people, this can't be done at the national level. There's too much of this is going on at the local level. But the people who care about this and can organize at that local level, which I talked about, have to find people who are willing to stick their necks out, stick their necks on the line. Then they have to be supported in campaigns. But I think they'll know who's effective at the community level better than I think you're gonna, if you create a national brand around this particular issue, you're gonna find candidates who are gonna have the zeal and the passion. And they're largely gonna come from activists in their community levels to begin with. They're going to be activist parents, activist teachers, activist reformers in their own schools who then need to be supported and moved up, elected to the state legislature, elected to governors, and make this a kind of front and center topic. You know, it's worked before in the past. I guess I've come back to my Clinton experience. You know, you had that whole, it's an endangered species now, the Democratic governor in the South. But I mean, the resurgence of Democratic governors was built on this question, you know. But Jim Hunt, you know, Clinton, the others, and the other progressive Democratic governors in the South.
The guy that beat you.
The guy that beat you. I wasn't,
Well, what's his name?
I wasn't going to go there.
You were, but you stopped. You were very polite. I could see that mind working.
You agree with this recruitment formula?
Yeah, look, politics is an entrepreneurial business. In fact, it's one of the most entrepreneurial of avocations. People that run for office take big risks. And so you don't have to, I don't think you have to like worry about people, you know, emerging with the possibility of service, because it's really cool to do that, and people are willing to take those risks. What I think you need to do is to think about how to build infrastructure and support around people who have a heart for reform so that they don't fall by the wayside. That to me is the lesson learned over the last 6 years of, you know, last 3 election cycles, is that this stuff is never final. You have to constantly be moving forward and advancing the cause, and in order to do that, you need to build a farm team, you need to support them, you need to nourish kind of the political environment where bigger ideas are being advocated by competent candidates.
Okay, last question from me before Patricia kills me for running over time. John alluded to the need for a vigorous federal role. We are sitting here in Washington. Next year, I see you're taking us to Boston, so we don't have to talk about the federal role next year. But this year we do. Very briefly, John, what do you see as the essence of the federal role? And Jeb, do you agree with him about it?
Well, look, I think I didn't say bigger, I said a vigorous federal role. And I think that there's no question that with respect to the issues around equity, that the federal government's role in education reform has been critical over the last couple of decades. Now, there have been lots of good stuff that happened at the states, but the federal government's emphasis on trying to provide educational equity is what has been there for, and I think if the federal role was completely eliminated from the system, we wouldn't get a happy result from that. But they also can do. I think that this emphasis that President Obama and Secretary Duncan have placed on competition, and not just race to the top, but through competition throughout the system of education is quite a good one. And I think the federal resources can be used to both support the development of new models and can force state experimentation in a way that's quite healthy. And so I think there needs to be a continued role, as I said, particularly around the issues around Title I and the issues around equity, but also in developing competitive models and new models nationally.
I would just so we're trying to be bipartisan here, so I will disagree on the margins. How about that? In the sense that I think Title I, for example, needs major reforms. So if we're going to spend a large sum of money that schools have become accustomed to, there should be accountability attached to that.
Yeah.
There hasn't been reform since its inception. Head Start could use major reforms. It could be more literacy-based. It could be more outcome-focused. There ought to be accountability. States ought to have the ability to use these monies in innovative ways. And where I think the Obama administration deserves some credit is that they have injected competition, but those are two places where maybe in the second term there could be efforts. And I would argue that the federal role, by definition, should be limited, but it can be a catalyst for reform. And what we ought to have is education ought to be something of great national purpose. It doesn't have to be driven by federal policy, but it ought to be, everybody ought to realize how important this is in the long term for our country's success. And if you focused on it as something of great national purpose, I think a lot of the governance issues begin to take care of themselves.
I think that's a swell note on which to end. Thank you both.
Thank you, Checker. Checker, can I make a... So I've got, on your tables are some boxes that have 2 medals in them. This is one of the cool things about being governor is your commander-in-chief, that we have some governors here, your commander-in-chief of your National Guards. So you get to have military medals that you give to people for a job well done. And we decided to give each person here 2 medals for the Foundation for Excellence in Education. 1 for yourself because you have a reformer's heart, for which we're very grateful. And 2 for someone who you want to convert to have a reformer's heart. So use them effectively. Think about who that person is in your state that you need to convert to the cause, and enjoy them.